Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is all about naming patterns continued. We also focus on first names as well. Irish surnames and first names are absolutely fascinating. And they're not without their drama and intrigue going back over the centuries. Irish surnames were frequently banned in the 16th century, or their use of, rather than banning them outright. Elizabeth I refused to allow the posthumous use of titles by the O'Neills, and O'Neill Moore was banned as a name. But it wasn't the first time that this had happened. In the 14th century, Englishmen in Ireland were obliged to take English surnames. In 1560, the O'Neill, which is now one of the top Irish surnames, they were basically told to desist. Shane O'Neill or Sean O'Neill had caused an amount of grief to the Tudor government who were trying to take over, and O'Neill Moore was seen as a very contentious title, which we always knew that about the O'Neills. Now, in relation to other names, the O'Brien, that was told to desist as well, because what they wanted to do was for titles to be taken. The Baron of Dungannon, the Earls of Thomond, and it was creating a fracture between the new names coming in and the old names and any perception of ownership of lands by a clan system. But first names are things that haven't been looked at, and actually Anglo-Normans, they kept their first naming patterns, which were very sounding English, such as Alice and Richard and so on. And when we talk about the Anglo-Norman surnames, we're frequently talking about the Barrys, the Brannocks, the Browns, the Burkes, the Butlers, the Crokes, the Fitzpatricks, Fitzmaurice, Fitzsimons, Nagels, Powers, Redmond, Roach, Russell, Tyrrell, also Stauntons as well. So, in relating to map the relative distribution of these surnames, we see what is known as, quote, territorial polarizations and gradations in the distribution of family surnames. So we can really work out what is happening and what lands are being contested over and what is being Gaelicized and what is being mixed and so on. William Nolan notices, or William Smith and these studies notice that the listing of surnames allows the researcher to identify the map and distribution of the descendants of Anglo-Norman settlers, who became known as the Old English in the mid-17th century. So really we have to look at the strength of a Gaelic naming pattern, where that is occurring, and match it to the changes that are happening in the 16th century. It surprised me to know that the Irish, becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves may not translate into the taking up of first names. And for instance, in a study done of the Hearth money rolls for Tipperary, done by Laffan, and the actual surnames, it was found that the retention of the saints' names by families amongst the Old English of the mid-17th century in Tipperary is astounding. And also the names such as Alice, William, Nicholas, Edward, Clare, Richard, David, Isabel, Honora, Catherine and Henry. And that's in that part of the country. So we really need to start looking at that as a serious form of study. And I'd love to see an atlas of surnames happening, just as you have the great atlas of the Irish famine and the revolution and so on, because I think it would be hugely beneficial. So when you're thinking of the saints' names in clusters like this, you need to think Anglo-Norman, where are they located, and that may give you a clue as to when you're tracing your Irish roots, and not just for your surnames, but for your first names as well. So those names again would be Alice, William, Nicholas, Edward, Clare, Richard, David, Isabel, Honora, Catherine, Henry, and they rule, quote, supreme. The descendants of the Anglo-Normans may have borrowed freely when it came to matters of poetry, song, music, and indeed language, but they yielded little symbolic territory in the use of Christian first names. And that comes from a wonderful article and a wonderful website of Documents of Ireland, the Atlas of Family Names in Ireland, William J. Smith. I have used it an awful lot for research over the years, and it is absolutely fascinating. Now, we look at the use of how people, when they can't get work or can't get on in life, how they may change or alter their surname. And this is true right up to modern days. Marilyn Monroe herself would not have been allowed to use the surname Doherty underneath because they found it too hard to pronounce. So she had to take an easier name. It's not as common for film stars today to change their surnames and so on. We have Saoirse Ronan and Ciarán Hinds. They keep their surnames as what they were born with. But in the old system, it just shows you just when things are hard in an Irish surname, spelling can be quite hard, that's what's going on there. It's not necessarily to become more English. It is because the surname is difficult to pronounce and it's difficult to get business or difficult to get on and so on. I've often said it with the surnames as well, where you're looking at Murphys, and Murphys, we've got 55,000 Murphys in Ireland today, but we have 300,000 Murphys in the US. Murphy is more common in Liverpool than what it would be possibly in parts of Ireland. So as a surname or a first name moves from one place to another, it can take root and grow and give you your polarizations and gradations and show you how evidence confirms the spread of settlement. And that's the same for the spread of settlement when people emigrate. And it's one of the great strengths we have with diaspora and Irish surname patterns and so on. So that's something that we really need to keep an eye on as well. Now, we've got many data sources which I want to allude to, 1659 census, and studies need to be done in those to show the prevalence of the surnames and the first names, hearth money rolls, so on. So one of the things that we need to be able to do is work out what type of richness is there. It's noticed in this source that I've alluded to today with the UCC website, the DOI Atlas, that it doesn't provide the same richness of data of Christian first names. But it does detail the listing of the first and second names of the highest poll taxpayers, the titulados, the gentry, the professionals, the merchants. So those with money, what names? It's not hard to differentiate the Old Irish from those of Old English, and they can be mapped. And that's important to look at in relation to when you're looking at this 1659 census as what's happening with those names. The diverse and regionalised Irish cultural expression is important that we're using, like even to know that saints' names are more prevalent in certain parts and certain counties is of great value when you're looking that you need to know how things are coming in. Universal saints' names had not penetrated Irish life before 1169. The Christian names Michael and Paul began to arrive after 1020, while Edmund, John, Margaret, Maria, Nicholas make a fleeting appearance before 1120, but the full introduction of the continental saints' names awaited the coming of the Anglo-Norman knights and their religious orders. So that is a really helpful notation to have for you. So if you have the name Richard going through your family and bits and other saints' names, Edmund, John, Margaret, Maria, Nicholas, so on, it's really important to look at. O'Corran and Maguire show that early Irish had an extraordinary mix of personal names. As many as 12,000 such names are documented in early Irish sources, which fell out of fashion at an early stage. So I have been looking at the Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Inishvallen, and it's there could be a great study done in that to bring it on and map it and to be able to bring further databases into place, because the introduction of a name is like the introduction of a brand. It changes the whole complexity of what is happening in the landscape and who is coming in and how names are lost and how names are gained. So they look at the O'Briens, the list of commonest first names, and they are very limited in some cases, but they haven't been divided up by century. And we could do that over time. Which are the most important names in the 11th century, instead of massing it all together like as if they were all named and framed at the same time. So naming patterns are important because certain names never appear than others. And we have the Annals of Inishvallen, the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of the Four Masters, and we can look at that. Now what we see, where we started with the O'Neills, is the introduction of the MacDonalds and other names, because there are Scottish lineages and marriages coming into Scotland, from Scotland to Ulster at that time, and not just with plantation. Prior to that, dynastic marriages, which are used to keep power within certain lineages as factions of the O'Neills fight and so on. Popular names such as Mary, Bridget, Brian only became fashionable in the late 10th and early 11th century. Adon, now popular again, fades out before the 10th century. Fergus, a solid name, but again, these names come and go. And just as we have patterns of that happening now today, it's important to see it. It's more common to give girls different naming patterns than boys. So even now, it's far more likely to remain with a conservative naming pattern when naming boys than naming girls. And that's very interesting to note, because we don't, it's such a marked distinction and a marked division. With the Normans' conquest, you get the depression of the local Gaelic names. You see the universal saints' names as first names, so you see the early adoption of Sean or John, Thomas, Tomas, William and Eamon by old Irish families from the middle of the 13th century onwards. So there we're looking at, instead of John, we get Owen or Sean. So we're looking at a resurgence, though, of Hugh, Ty, Donnacha, Dermot, Connor, and a less powerful but sharp revival of names such as Angus and Fergal, and archaic names like Carpra. So it will be interesting to look at all the names that disappear, because they're telling us what's going on in the landscape. So do go and look at your own family history name, and you can search for it using the UCC Celt website and go into the annals and download them as single, or look at them as single files, and do a Control F and search and go through that and just start seeing. And you can go through the Irish version as well, because that would maybe be more telling of what the name is. Now, the Moyle names in the surnames start coming in because you've got an increase in church posts and church jobs. And so these Moyle names start coming on from year 920 and so on. Enumerated any time, as John Grenham says, you get a list of names, you get a genealogy source. So that's really important to start being able to note. Now, women's first names. Only Southwest Cork yields a sample of its secrets, with Mary, Anne and Elizabeth being the most popular names, and with names such as Sophia, Hester, Abigail, Charity, Susan and Grace also represented. The 1641 depositions give a much greater sample of women's surnames, and the 1641 depositions can be found on the Trinity College website, that project that was done. So when this source that I'm looking at was put together, the 1641 deposition site wasn't there for you to look at online. Elizabeth is a very clear winner. Margaret, Mary, Anne, Jane, Joanne and Alice. Catherine and Eleanor. Dorothy, Ellen, Grace and Isabel. Names such as Charity, Eliza, Judith, Madeline and Joyce speak to new cultural impulses as both the reality and perception of Protestant Christian names as opposed to Catholic forms take root. So what we've got here with names is two division with the Reformation. And we haven't looked at that really with first names in genealogical studies or academic studies. It's something I'm very, very interested in indeed, to see that cultural impulse. I believe it to be more than a cultural impulse. It is a matter of life and death in some areas, and it's a matter of taking on a new route so that you're becoming successful and able to trade and so on. So then you have Scots Presbyterian colonisation and settlement in the second half of the 17th century and early part of the 18th century. We know that the Johnstons become MacShanes. That can be a rare process. The John becomes more dominant in the Catholic side of the equation. Patrick leaps into second place and becomes 6 times more fashionable in the mid-20th century as in the mid-17th century. Key names such as Michael and Joseph emerge from the shadows in the Middle Ages to become the 3rd and 7th most popular names, respectively, by the mid-17th century. But where does that leave us with the naming patterns of families? Because it's people who get named names. And the important thing here is to realise that the perpetuation of a whole mix of first names is something you should be taking down and having with you so that you understand if someone was never named Richard or Alice in your family, how significant that is if you have the same surname in a particular area of Tipperary and so on. So cultural terrain has been negotiated and traversed over centuries, according to Willie Smith. Great continuities also prevailed. So Irish fashion in the continued use of the forename is very distinctive. Irish second or surname system. So when we look at that, and then we've got to look at double names as well. John Joseph, Patrick Joseph. There's a whole wealth of information to be gained in this as well. So this is really interesting in relation to our Irish family naming system, that we don't just look at surnames, we look at first names as well. And that concludes the show today. Just want to make a few announcements. We air the show from Radio Corkabashkin in beautiful Kilkee, and we're going to be looking at some lovely apps next week where you can take photographs and send them as postcards and all sorts of things like that, and interesting things you can do in relation to family history and family lore. We're putting together the school at UCC that'll be held in Skellig Cree, and it'll be a 3-day event in May 2020. So please do get in contact if you're interested in same. And we want to deliver most of that online as well and make it available online to those who won't be able to travel to us. But we're interested in exploring our rural hinterlands and creating those links and ties overseas and abroad. So that's all for today. Our genealogy radio show has gone on for 5 years, and we're planning on to continuing for many more. And we also have links to the shows in the past. I will be going into creating video lectures and getting a little bit more adventurous in the next few months. So I would welcome your support, and please do contact me on same at irishroutes@clansandsurnames.com. We'll be putting that up on www.clansandsurnames.com as well as trace your Irish roots. So thanks for listening.